you all call him Pastor Tracy, Dr. Winborn, and a host of other wonderful names that you call him. But I'll tell you, I call him one thing, and that's Batman. And I'll tell you the story. So in 1997, we worked together. And I had a little green sports car convertible. It was a really nice car. And we would show up all over Fort Hood in that car. And they would always say, "Here comes Batman and Robin. Here comes the dynamic duo." And I was, pretty impressed with that until I realized that I was Robin. Yeah. He was Batman. Tracy was Batman. And so we've had a wonderful 23 years together of fellowship, and our work never got in the way of our theology. Did you notice what I just said? Our work never got in the way of our theology, because we praise God in all kinds of environments. When he's in the box, when I'm in the box, me fighting to get him back on the team when he was coming out of Afghanistan. And so I love this brother. And as we celebrate African American History Month, I will tell you that your First Lady could very well be on this chart. She was one of the few women Apache pilots. But then when you start saying African American pilots, I didn't know any male pilots. Apache, that's a TAC helicopter. That's what we call, she's a natural born killer. So don't get her too upset. Because if she has this helmet that she can just turn her head and the gun goes towards you, watch it. Okay, don't get her upset. But I had the opportunity in my one-star job in the Pentagon to work to open all specialties within the military to women, all specialties. And I would tell you that comes off of the back of one of the first women in the combat arms, Rita Winborn. And so if you didn't know that, she is absolutely a heroine in African American history and in military history. And so all of these women who are now going to Ranger School, who are now in the infantry, in the armor, and flying Apaches, they stand taller because they stand on your shoulders. So thank you for that reason. Now, I want to tell you all about something that happened to me on the plane coming in from Washington yesterday. I guess it's my face or whatever, but I always sit next to the person who wants to talk, right? And so that was yesterday as well. And so a man sat next to me and he said, "Do you have any kids?" I said, "Yeah, I have a son. He's 12. He said, "Oh, let me give you some advice. I had 3 boys." And I'm like, wow, I really want to sleep on this flight. But I listened, and so he said, "I had a son, Caleb." And let me tell you about Caleb. When he turned 16, Caleb got his driver's permit, and then he got his license, and he wanted greater privileges with the car. And I said, "Caleb, well, look, I need you to do 3 things for me, and I won't only give you greater privileges with the car, but I'll buy you a car." I said, "Well, what were those 3 things?" He said, "Well, I told him that I need you to improve your grades in school." He was doing about a 2.8, but he needed him to do much better so that he might get a scholarship. So I said, okay. And then he said he wanted Caleb to cut his hair because he had excessively long hair. And then the third thing was that he wanted him to go to Bible study. And Pastor Ron, we're great Bible study this morning on the shack. And I thought about Caleb as you were sharing this morning. So I said, "Well, how did it go?" He said, "Well, Caleb moved his GPA from 2.8 to a 3.5 in 6 months." I said, "Wow, that's pretty impressive." He said, and his teacher at church school, at Bible school, said that Caleb was the best of breed, that he was naming books of the Bible. He could quote scripture. He knew all the major and minor prophets in the Bible. I said, well, what about the hair? How did he do with the hair? And he said, well, that's where he kind of threw me for a loop. I said, well, what happened? He said, well, Caleb said, Dad, I've been reading the Bible. And Moses had long hair. Jacob, Abraham, Joshua, even Jesus the Christ had long hair. And I said, he kind of got you on that one. He said, no. I said, well, what happened? He said, I looked my son in the face. And I said, yes, they all had long hair, but they walked everywhere they went. Caleb didn't get a car, but I'm going to hold that one for my son, William, because I think I got an opportunity to use that one again on my son, William. So Pastor Ron gave a remarkable history of Carter G. Woodson and the role that he played in the creation of Negro History Week. But I want to answer a broader question on why African American History Month. Now, everybody has heard the questions that come up, right? Why are we doing this? Why is it necessary? And I really want to answer 4 questions. Why are we here today? Why do we do this every year? Don't events like this isolate and hence further divide the races? And do we need an African American History Month? Those are the 4 questions. That's all I have on the card. Is that fair? And what I'd like to do is to weave in some scholarship that my academic research and my PhD program at Texas A&M kind of informed me with some insight. Now, these questions that you may have asked those questions. I certainly will tell you that I've entertained those questions. Is it needed? Is it necessary anymore? And so let's go through it. So why are we here today? The answer is simple: to celebrate the contributions and the legacy of African Americans towards the building and development of our great country. And these are pioneers in our nation who's helped to do that. Second question, why do we do this every year? And Pastor Ron gave you the details on the why. February was selected only because it's the birth month of the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass and the great emancipator Abraham Lincoln. It's not because it's the shortest month in the thing. It's not that month to diss black folk. It's only because those 2 seminal figures in the plight of African Americans were born 2 days apart in the month of February. Now on the third one, I'm going to use a couple of slides. Don't events like this isolate and hence further divide the races? And I want to just walk through a couple of slides. And if you look at every ethnicity since the Pilgrims who've donned the shores of the Americas, somebody was here when they came, right? So we say Columbus discovered America, but somebody was here. So if you think about the migration pattern of every ethnicity that's dawned the shores, and oh, by the way, the Pilgrims were booted out of England and out of the Anglican Church. So they came here as a method of generating revenue for the British Crown. They came here to build a society that the British Crown might tax. Hence, we had the Revolution. So this is the process for every immigrant that came to the shores of America. They arrived. They went through this period of struggle and perseverance. Hence, we call it paying your dues. And then they assimilated. Now, indentured servitude is like slavery. Most immigrants that came to America came as indentured servants. What's the difference? An indentured servant, you pay your dues and you can buy your way out. Somebody had to sponsor you in coming here. And then once you got yourself on your feet, then you can buy your own freedom, and then you begin your life. What's the process for Africans, though? How did they come here? And this is the speed round of Jeopardy, and so you could talk back to me, okay? So how did Africans arrive? Yeah, forcibly brought. They came on slave ship through the Middle Passage. And the question is, what does this period of struggle and perseverance look like for Africans? 1862, September 1st, 1862, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. That becomes effective on 1 January of 1863. How many people does the Emancipation Proclamation free? That's not a trick question. The answer is 0. See, if you look at the document and what it said, the document says that slaves will be freed in places where Union troops were not. It really was a diversionary tactic by Lincoln to do 2 things. One, it created the path to citizenship, which meant you could arm blacks now. Secondly, it was designed to cause Confederate troops to come back home to guard and protect the slaves, to safeguard the slaves so that they wouldn't run off. The unfortunate piece that Lincoln didn't know, that we all know, there was no headline news, no CNN, no MSNBC, no Radio 1 to put the word out that, hey, you know you've been freed? They didn't know. And so when you look at like Texas in 1865, June the 19th of 1865, General Granger comes ashore in Galveston, and they celebrate now in many southern states Juneteenth, which is the day that slaves were truly freed. Not many were even freed after the Civil War. And what happens to when you free a person who's been enslaved? Pastor Tracy spoke about the gentleman in the video. What did he do after being in prison for 30 years? Where did he stay? He went and stayed with his friend, right? Because what didn't he have? He didn't have resources, right? He didn't have a home. And so many of the relationships between master and former slave didn't change. They became tenant farmers. They worked to survive, but they were never making a way out. The 1860s, 1870s, 13th Amendment is passed. What does it do? It abolishes slavery. It still maintains that slaves are like people who are in prison. They have no rights. They are considered slaves in the Constitution. 14th Amendment does what? It gives them citizenship. And what comes with citizenship? The right to vote. But who was it for? It was for men. I'm not trying to start anything, First Lady, but it was only for men. Women wouldn't get that right until 1919 with the 19th Amendment. Okay? There was what happens after 1875? Sweeping legislation happens in America that gives civil rights legislation that gives blacks freedoms that they wouldn't even experience post Martin Luther King. 1882, the Supreme Court overturns that legislation. 1886 to 1914, 3,426 recorded lynchings of African Americans in the country. 3,426. That's a small city in America. That many recorded lynchings. Imagine how many happened that we didn't know about. 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, which establishes the separate but equal doctrine in our nation. And that would maintain Jim Crow, disenfranchisement would stay in America through the civil rights movement led by Dr. Martin Luther King. Many would say that America would have reached a post-racial society with two elections of Barack Obama. But look at the state of race relations now in America. Credible argument is saying that African Americans have not assimilated, which means to be absorbed into the larger culture, that they've acculturated, that they didn't give away who they were, but they became African American. Let's look at scholarship. 155 years since the end of the Civil War through present. And this is a model that Wilhelm Hegel developed called the Hegelian dialectic. This is a process, a vetting process that scholarship goes through to be received into the mainstream of history. And if you look at the plight of African Americans over this, now the process says that it goes from thesis of prevailing thought to antithesis, which challenges or debunks the prevailing view, to synthesis, which is like consensus, where we all agree on what transpired. And Hegel's process says that it goes from this to this to this to be absorbed into the mainstream of American history. Well, let's look at what happened with African Americans. There was this period known as the period of paternalism. Now, if you think about what does it mean, paternalism, it's inherently racist. There was a thesis that was a happy-darky thesis that said that blacks were these unintelligible beings that God created for servitude. That in the sweltering heat of the South, because of the pigmentation of the skin, that they could handle being outdoors, that God ordained them for slavery. Anthropological studies were commissioned that said that the brain matter of blacks was somehow smaller than their white counterparts. We're in church, and so I would just say that's a bunch of hooey. Fill in the blank of what that means. These are the proponents of this period of paternalism. And oh, by the way, movies like The Birth of the Nation showed these Sambo-like figures who had nothing. They were like savages. William Archibald Dunning was the main proponent. Columbia-educated professor at Columbia, and he is the teacher of all of these other guys. And history, which I have a PhD in history, you study history not based on the school, but you study history based on the teacher that you want to align to. And so all of these great minds were going to Columbia to study under William Archibald Dunning. And then, like disciples, he sent them back out into the world to spread the news, right? And this guy, Claude Bowers, was an ambassador. He was on FDR's staff. So imagine the influence that he had. And so that they put out a patently racist and paternalistic view of Africans during their time. And they were, you could see that period lasted from 1865 to 1928. End of the American Civil War, populism, the start of Plessy versus Ferguson happens here, separate but equal happens here, the First World War happens here. We said that the process says it goes from this to this to this, right? So it follows suit with this period of transition, 1929 to 1946. And look who's telling the story. PhD, Harvard-educated W.E.B. Du Bois. PhD, Harvard-educated Carter G. Woodson. You know, are telling the story and writing about the black experience. W.E.B. Du Bois is the initial leader of the NAACP. You know, he creates this magazine called Crisis Magazine that's educating and informing, that's countering the narrative from the period of paternalism. You have the Harlem Renaissance, and authors like Langston Hughes are telling about the black experience, and they're infusing our music and our poetry and our culture. You know, you have the advent of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, you know, and he's talking to people about dressing for success and standing up with your back straight. You have Negroes coming back from the First World War, like the Harlem Hellfighters, you know, who paid the blood sacrifice. You know, guess what? In the First World War, the AEF, the American Expeditionary Force, Pershing said that no American would fight outside of the AEF. But yet all the Negroes fought with the French. Were they not Americans? What happens from that experience, too, they come back to the nation with their back straight. You know, King said, when a man has his back straight, you can't get on his back. It's hard to sit on a man's back when his back is straight. And so what happens is, these guys they come back with their back straight, and they're not submissive, because they paid the blood sacrifice in the war. We said the process goes from here to here. Can everybody see the little green dot? Yeah, from here to here to here. It's following suit, but look what happens next. It goes back to thesis. Period of maturation. Look what happened. Look who's writing. White PhDs and scholars writing about the black experience, but they're writing biographies. They're not writing about the whole experience. They're writing biographies. They're debunking things that happened way back here, you know, that said they got it wrong, you know, these authors. And oh, by the way, look at the years, 1947 to 1970. What happens then? We had just come out of the Second World War. Our currency changed to say, in God we trust. There's a red scare and a scare of communism and the dominoes falling where all countries would become communist. And what happens? What do we respond? We create America. The Pledge of Allegiance is introduced here. Guess when the Star-Spangled Banner came into being? During this period, in the 30s, in the mid-30s. But here we come up with the Pledge of Allegiance and scholarship that's coming out, that's being written on the black experience, speaks of one country, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. They're not telling the story of the struggle. Scholarship's not telling it. The world has no idea what's going on in America. Guess what Hitler does during the Second World War? He writes articles in American newspapers saying to Negroes, why do you want to fight for this country that even segregates your blood? I'm not getting fired up. I'm just okay. Yeah. Okay. It stays in thesis, and there's accommodation. And I'm going to tell you what the accommodation was. And you have multi-ethnic writers who are a part of this. And the accommodation was that African American history would be accepted as a subset of American history. So you start with multiracial classes. You have African American specific electives in colleges, ethnic specific electives in college, and what that created was what Ralph Ellison called the invisible man theory. Now we all know what it means to be invisible, right? But let me tell you what it means in history. So I usually carry a suitcase with me with 70 pounds of books. But that's pretty expensive now on a plane, right? It's a little bitty suitcase with 70 pounds of books with about 40 books that are currently being utilized in middle school, in high school, and in college survey history courses, U.S. history courses. And what that book does is that what's absent now in American history, if you peruse the table of contents or the glossary, and in any of those books, you don't find the name Crispus Attucks. The first man, an African American, the first man to die in the first pitched battle that would lead to the American Revolution. He's not mentioned. There's no mention in those books the name Benjamin Banneker. When L'Enfant, the guy who was supposed to have designed our nation's capital, he's a Frenchman, so he was a little emotional. That was a joke. And I didn't mean for that to be judgmental, Pastor Tracy, at your church. So, but when L'Enfant quit and took his plans, Benjamin Banneker redrew those plans from memory. This guy is the guy responsible for designing Washington, D.C. Also ahead of Benjamin Franklin, he's the first guy to publish an almanac in our country. He's not mentioned. There's no mention of this lady, Madam Elizabeth Keckley. How many of you saw the movie Lincoln? Raise your hands. Raise your hands if you saw the movie Lincoln. Do you remember there's a black lady all over the White House, in the galleries, when they're talking about the 13th Amendment? You remember that lady? That was her. She's our nation's first high fashion designer. She designed ball gowns for both Mary Todd Lincoln and also for Jefferson Davis's wife. She was the lady of glam during her day. And oh, by the way, we learned about the plight of Mary Todd Lincoln after the assassination of the president from her pen. Her writings is what exposed to the nation how Mary Todd Lincoln was doing. She's not mentioned in those books. There's no mention of this guy in those history books, Lewis Latimer. Lewis Latimer is the guy who worked with Alexander Graham Bell on the telephone. Oh, by the way, when Thomas Edison created the electric light, he had a paper filament. Guess what happens when you mix electricity with paper? He's the guy who designed the filament for the electric light. Yeah, he's not mentioned in any of those history books. And oh, by the way, you say, well, why didn't he get the patent for it? He was African American. They weren't allowed to get patent. There's no mention of this guy, Colonel Charles Young, who last week in Kentucky, was honorarily promoted to Brigadier General. This guy was the senior guy in the Army every day that he served in the Army, from 1889 to 1921. This guy, when he was up for colonel, his medical records revealed that he had hypertension, and as a testament of his fitness, he rode an old swayback horse named Dolly from Xenia, Ohio, 485 miles to the War Department. Now, because she's an old swayback, history has it that occasionally he rode the horse. Most of the time, he walked beside the horse. And then on occasion, he put the horse on his back and carried it. God forgive me. Yeah, forgive me for that. There's no mention of Colonel Charles Young in that thing. There's no mention of Seaman First Class Dorie Miller. During Pearl Harbor, as most people, when the Japanese Zeros found their marks, as most people were going below deck, jumping over the ship, running towards the shore. This guy took to the anti-aircraft gun, no training, and shot down as few as 5, but as many as 9 Japanese Zeros. And it was the black press that got him recognized. The Secretary of the Navy wasn't going to do anything with them. And FDR personally told the Secretary of the Navy to award this guy the Navy Cross. When the ship left, now he was a messman. It was a segregated Navy, and when the fleet left, guess who was on the ship? Dorie Miller, and he died at sea on the aircraft carrier Liscombe Bay. The next aircraft carrier that will be commissioned for our nation, they're usually named after 4-star or 5-star admirals or presidents. The next aircraft carrier that our nation will commission will be named after Dorie Miller. They just announced that 2 weeks ago. There's no mention, though he's on the wall over here, in any of those history books, of the name Dr. Charles Drew, a scientist. This guy taught the world how to preserve blood. The first blood bank that's created in the world was created for the Brits as a result of Charles Drew's research. He's not mentioned in any of those history books. I just love this lady because I like the hat, right? Mary McLeod Bethune. This lady created the first women's high school, all women's high school. Created an African American, a predominantly historically black college, Bethune-Cookman in Daytona Beach, Florida. She was an advisor to 5 sitting presidents. And when the United League of Women was created, she was its president. This is a multiracial society that focused on the rights for women. She was the president of that, Mary McLeod Bethune. She's not mentioned in those history books. Garrett Morgan, the guy who invented the protective mask during the First World War, the very same protective mask, gas mask that we use today. It's the creation of Garrett Morgan, an African American. He also created or invented the stoplight. He's not mentioned in any of those history books. A. Philip Randolph. We all know of King's March, the March on Washington. You know, in King's famed I Have a Dream speech. Did you know that wasn't King's idea? That this was A. Philip Randolph's idea. He had advocated such a feat since the beginning of the Second World War. He wanted to do it because he wanted African Americans to have the opportunity to serve in the combat arms. That March on Washington was the creation of A. Philip Randolph. There's no mention in those books the name Dr. Percy Julia. He developed a less expensive alternative for cortisone, an artificial alternative, which was much less expensive. He also developed a treatment for glaucoma. He's not mentioned in those books. There's no mention of this lady, Ella Baker, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which really has its roots in the state of North Carolina, Greensboro. This is the lady who had been a protege of W.E.B. Du Bois in the NAACP. She would become the first executive director of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the first woman to hold that position. She is the person who really taught the students how to protest. Ella Baker. There's no mention in those books of this guy, James Farmer Jr., who was the president of the Congress of Racial Equality. Any of you see the movie The Great Debaters with Denzel Washington? Yeah. You remember the kid who debated? That was him. son of Reverend James Farmer, but he is the guy who spearheaded the freedom rides from Washington, D.C. to New Orleans to protest segregated facilities on interstate highways. He's not mentioned in those books. And Dr. Frederick Reese, Selma. Everybody knows about Selma, right? This guy is why King came to Selma. He was the president of the teachers union, the black teachers union in Selma. And he was incensed because these literacy tests that were being administered. And so he'd have teachers who were educated go and take these literacy tests, and he was like, these things are impossible. You can't win. And so he's the guy who invited King and King's apparatus into Selma, which really became the apparatus for outlawing poll taxes and literacy tests. He's not mentioned in any of those books. So I go to the fourth question that I had for you is, why is there a continued need for African American History Month? And the reality is that the history, the literature shows that there is no other venue or vehicle for learning about the people who are listed on this wall except for doing this month. That's when we take a moment to pause to profile these luminaries in African American or in American history. Yes, sir.
Why do you think they're not mentioned?
Because of the accommodation that was reached, which is black history would be considered a subset of American history. Yeah. Okay. I thank you all for your time. I thank you for the invitation to come and speak with you, and Pastor Winborn, I want to thank you for inviting me into your home, and thank you for inviting me to share with your flock today. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Oh, look at that. Oh, wow. So this is the dynamic duo. And I'm assuming he's saying this is from Batman to Robin.
I love you, brother.
I love you more. Love you more. That's perfect. That's perfect. Yeah. Thank you all very much.